All right, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I assume some more audience members will join as I give my introductory remarks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kobe Rizik, and I am the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program here at Yale. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the fourth and final panel of our 2020 annual conference on 60 years since the 60s. Today's panel, entitled "In the Shadow of Vietnam, America's Legacy of Adventurism Abroad," will feature Professor Andrew Bacovich, Professor Charles Hill, and Professor Walter Russell Mead. We hope to cover a lot of ground in this panel, and we hope that will include a reflection on the legacy of the conflict in Vietnam and its impact on the trajectory of American foreign policy and culture. We hope that by discussing the foreign policy legacy of such a controversial decade, we can better understand today's world order and where it may be headed in future years. Before I introduce our guest this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley program. First, for those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference like this one, which we've done every year since 2010. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a Buckley Fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible. Now on to our guests today. Professor Andrew Bacovich is the president of the Quincy Institute and Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. He grew up in Indiana, graduated from West Point and Princeton, served in the Army, became an academic, and is now a writer. He's the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books. Among them are The New American Militarism, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. And that came out in January of this year. Professor Bacovich is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University and has held fellowships at the Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies, the John F. Kennedy School of Government, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the American Academy in Berlin. Professor Charles Hill is a diplomat in residence and lecturer in international studies at Yale University. He's a career minister in the U.S. Foreign Service, serving in a variety of roles, such as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East and at the State Department, Chief of Staff of the same, and Executive Aide to former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz. Professor Hill has been a fellow at the Harvard University East Asia Research Center, a Clark Fellow at Cornell University, and is currently a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He served as special consultant on policy to the Secretary General of the United Nations from 1992 to 1996. Professor Hill has collaborated with former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali on Egypt's Road to Jerusalem, a memoir of the Middle East peace negotiations, and Unvanquished about US relations with the UN in the post-Cold War period. He's also the editor of the 3-volume papers of UN Secretary General Ghali, published by Yale University Press. His book, Grand Strategies, Literature, Statecraft, and World Order, is published by the Yale University Press as well. His Trial of 1,000 Years, Islamism and World Order, is published by the Hoover Press at Stanford. Professor Walter Russell Mead is the Ravenel B. Curry III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute, the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College in New York. He's also a member of Aspen Institute Italy and a board member of Aspenia. Before joining Hudson, Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations as the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy. He's authored numerous books, including the widely recognized Special Providence, American Foreign Policy, and How It Changed the World. Professor Mead's, next book is entitled The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. For our audience, just for your information, we'll begin by having each of our three guests give a brief opening statement of 5 to 8 minutes, followed by 1 or 2 questions from myself, and then we will move into questions from the audience here on Zoom. So please be sure to submit a question or 2 on the Q&A feature, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. And we will conclude this event at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, please join me in warmly welcoming Professors Andrew Bacovich, Charles Hill, and Walter Russell Mead virtually to the Buckley program. We're going in alphabetical order, so Professor Bacovich, you may begin your opening statements. Thank you again for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for the generous introduction and for including me in this program. I'll make 2 basic points to describe my sense of the legacy of Vietnam. Point number 1 is that the Vietnam War caused the American people to abandon the tradition of the citizen soldier, which had formed the basis of the American military system going as far back as the Revolution. The president at the time, Nixon, and the Congress agreed to create a standing army as a replacement for the citizen force, thereby disregarding the warnings of the founders. This so-called all-volunteer force, as it matured, became a skilled but relatively small military force, relatively small in comparison to the ambitions of American policymakers, particularly after the Cold War. Some people anticipated, but not that many, that the creation of the all-volunteer force might develop, lead to the development of a gap separating the American people from their armed forces. And in fact, that has happened. As a subsequent result, political elites gained much greater leeway in when, how, and where to employ the U.S. Armed Forces, and this resulted in the post-Cold War period in a pattern of, in my judgment, reckless and counterproductive military activism, really reaching its zenith in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, with in particular, the war in Iraq that began in 2003. And to make matters worse, there has been really negligible accountability with regard to U.S. military policy, despite a pattern of failure. I think that one of the principal explanations for this lack of accountability is public apathy, concealed, of course, by the rhetoric of supporting the troops, which we hear constantly. That's my first point. Second point relates more directly to the way that the armed forces, and in particular, the way that the U.S. Army responded to its failure in Vietnam. It responded by turning away from the possibility of war against irregular forces. Nobody was more passionately committed to the notion of no more Vietnams than was the officer corps. So the end of the Vietnam War found the United States military, again, in particular the Army, I think was the lead here, in undertaking a series of military reforms focused on reshaping the services as instruments to fight conventional wars against adversaries that were themselves conventionally armed and conventionally organized. Further, the officer corps, particularly after Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the officer corps bought into a form of military utopianism that was informed by the conviction that advanced information technology is the deciding factor and will continue to be the deciding factor in modern warfare. all of this then left our military badly unprepared when conventional campaigns, Afghanistan and Iraq, conventional campaigns morphed into protracted unconventional wars. What were the results? The results were military and strategic failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, despite enormous and costly efforts, despite our claims to have the best military that the world has ever seen. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Hill?
With the term Vietnam, we really have entered a kind of new dimension in the sense that the word Vietnam now resonates far beyond a place and even a war. You can say Vietnam and win arguments by simply using the word. So the term Vietnam, in some sense, is a barrier to trying to understand what it was and why it was and what really happened there. And I think that's really perhaps our task today. What is the U.S. role in Vietnam or something like a Vietnam situation? Where did it fit into the general overall matter of world order or American foreign policy? And what actually happened? How did it turn out? I think all of those points are really not in front of the public, even not in front of those who should be specializing in it. And in a way, trying to answer those questions is perhaps our job today. Underneath all of this, to me, living through it and having been in Vietnam during the war, the general issue seemed to be then and still seems to me to be today, was this a war of liberation by people in a particular country of Asia to cast off a form of autocracy, even dictatorship, that was supported by the US for worldwide strategy reasons. Which was it? Was it local or was it international? And the media at the time seemed to me very much came down on the side that this is a local war. It is a war of the people of South Vietnam to overthrow, to cast off a government that is involved with the United States and doing what it's doing in a context of a larger international role that is really mistaken. So which is it? And the back and forth in the media seemed to come out of a consensus within the media that it's local, whereas watching it, being in it, it certainly was international in the sense of the North Vietnamese government, Hanoi, trying again and again to take over South Vietnam and to make that part of a unified Vietnam that would have its capital in the north, would be supported by communism in China, and would change the strategic balance in Asia and even worldwide. So the stakes in this were really very high. And the argument went back and forth, although I don't think it was caught particularly effectively by those experts looking at it, or supposed to be looking at it, or by the public. And that was, what kind of a war really was it? A war of liberation, which could be considered to be a positive thing from the American point of view? Or was it that, yes, but also something that could change the dimension of the larger strategic issues in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Asia, and beyond that as a whole.
Thank you, Professor Hill. Professor Mead?
Hi, it's good to be back, even virtually at Yale. Thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be on a panel that is so distinguished, so much more distinguished than me, I might say. Look, thinking about the impact of the Vietnam War on the United States, it's a little paradoxical because in a way the Vietnam War had a lot less impact on the United States, certainly than many people at the time thought it would have. And so what I guess I'll do is maybe talk just briefly about what I think some of the consequences were, but also say just a little bit about why they may not have been greater. Militarily, I think Professor Bacovich did a pretty good job, although it made the war made the military cautious, and it meant the end of the conscript army or the conscript armed forces. I wouldn't actually say it was a departure from the citizen army because, in fact, for most of American history, we had professional armed forces, and it was really only from World War II to Vietnam that the draft brought the body of the public in. There were certainly wars, World War I, the Civil War, but it was a professional force, and actually it was used quite widely in the 19th century. So the U.S. forces were deployed on all the continents except for Antarctica, fought 2 battles in Korea in the 1870s. So it was a professional force, and it was used globally in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I think the shift to the professional force ended up actually contributing a great deal to America's sort of comparative military strength. Making that shift earlier than China or the Soviet Union actually drove a kind of a modernization of the American force. Culturally and politically, the Vietnam War probably had its greatest impact on the U.S. and on U.S. political culture. I think it brought an end to a kind of an unnatural period of kind of consensus that goes from the World War II era into the early Cold War period. In particular, on the left, the Democratic Party had, in 1945, 46, 47, you had a large group of really quite left-wing people. Henry Wallace's 1948 run for the presidency on the progressive ticket crystallized a lot of that. And you had your sort of centrist liberals, your Hubert Humphreys in the Americans for Democratic Action, who kind of pushed all that way off the field in order to have a unified liberal democratic support for a strong Cold War policy. Vietnam sort of broke that open and allowed a much more anti-Cold War left-wing voice back into American politics in a mainstream way. Changed the Democrats, had an enormous impact on a generation of democratic foreign policy thinkers, many of whom, like Richard Holbrooke, served in Vietnam in the Foreign Service, not in the military, in his youth. And actually, if you want to read a good book about this impact, I'd say George Packer's recent biography of Richard Holbrooke is a very good one. It did not have the same kind of impact on the Republican side. And the recent book by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, A Life of James Baker, is a pretty good book if you want to sort of look at this at the side of the American foreign policy world that was less emotionally or culturally impacted by the war. Geopolitically, again, the war had, some impact, but but not, again, there are all kinds of people who talked about sort of the end of American power in Asia at the end of the war. Lee Kuan Yew, I think, may have gotten it best when he said that the Vietnam War, at great expense and with a lot of damage, sort of gave countries like his in Southeast Asia an opportunity to sort of develop and crystallize. And so it may be that had Vietnam, South Vietnam fallen much earlier, you might have seen the kind of dominoes that some people worried about. But by 1970, things had moved on quite a bit in that part of the world. So that, those are all impacts that it had, but it's interesting to look back and see, Vietnam War didn't end containment. The United States continued this global policy of trying to contain the Soviet Union. There was more dissidence about it, and there were fights over what the CIA was and wasn't doing and so on, but these turned out to be rather marginal. And why? And culturally, people said, "Oh my gosh, the boomers after the '60s and the trauma of Vietnam." People talked about the boomers in the '70s, sort of the way they talk about millennials now. The first post-American generation, you heard that a lot. They were going to be socialists. They were going to embrace all these radically different values, and of course, some people did and do. But over time, the kind of bulk of the generation, sort of most of the apples turned out not to fall that far from most of the trees. So in that sense, it's a disturbance in their youth, which most boomers kind of gradually, moved on from. So why was the impact so little? I think it's because of a story that people don't look at enough, which is that American power genuinely was in a real crisis in the early middle 1970s between the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the oil and energy price spikes, depression, inflation. It was a very, very tough time. And politically, internationally, there was a lot of sort of what kind of power will America be after Vietnam? But again, by the 1980s, the sort of resilience of American power was what people were talking about. And both at home and abroad, the United States had kind of reconstituted a new it had made some adjustments, but basically had found a new way of waging the Cold War, a new way of organizing its relations with allies, a new way of organizing its economy in an atmosphere of higher energy prices. And so went on to, after years of expecting the end of American power and the end of the American century and all of this, you had this sort of revival in 1989. People are talking about the unipolar moment. So so I think it was the aftermath of the Vietnam War that may have been more decisive in some ways than the actual war itself.
Thank you, Professor Mead. So I wanted to follow up on something that the three of you all mentioned sort of in a different way, which was, how did the conflict of Vietnam fit into the larger United States foreign policy strategy and grand strategy during the 60s? What would you say is its context in a larger the larger story of the Cold War? And then lastly, specifically the policy of containment. I think you, Professor Mead, mentioned that it caused many in the American foreign policy establishment to question or at least reconsider the strategy of containment. Can the three of you talk a little bit about kind of those 3 points? Whoever wants to begin can begin.
Well, I can go. I think one of the things that occurred as a result of Vietnam, and maybe more specifically occurred as a result of the efforts of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, was to greatly reduce the ideological dimension of the Cold War. And if we try to understand why the United States, in an act of great folly, Americanized the Vietnam War, chose to intervene, chose to send 500,000 soldiers to try to preserve this country of rather dubious provenance. And I think the explanation has to do with anti-communism. The perception that communism was a monolith. The perception that Soviet leaders in the Kremlin were pulling the strings. That somehow or other that they were giving marching orders that the leaders in Beijing or leaders in Hanoi responded to. I think all of that perception was deeply flawed. And by the time we get to the latter stages of the Vietnam War, Nixon, it seems to me, acknowledges that. And he acknowledges that by going to China, by creating this de facto partnership between the United States and communist China, Red China, as we used to say, at the expense of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War does continue after the Vietnam War, but it, in my judgment, is no longer informed by the ideological fervor that had existed from the late 40s well into the 1960s. It's now a geopolitical competition, and it remains a geopolitical competition until its resolution at the end of the 1980s. And I think that Nixon deserves enormous credit for that transformation, and it was an act of real creative statesmanship.
I think you need to look at what was happening on a world scale at that time, because the late 60s, I think, now look as though they were really a transformative, gigantic shift in, you might say, world consciousness. So what was going on then? In a way, I think it is a global matter. Our idea of Vietnam and our Vietnam War was really a piece of a larger world pattern that I think can be traced to China, to Mao Zedong, and the Red Guards of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So viewed from the university, and I was in and teaching in and a fellow at universities during this time, the changes were really dramatic. And they were all on the side of moving toward culture. So the idea of Mao's Red Guards really swept, in a way, the world, or the westernized world. We would have Paris 68, and American universities, European culture, all being affected by this. And the changes really were in the category of, from an earlier idea, or the standard traditional idea of what a world conflict would be about, changed toward culture. So you take, and you may perhaps trace this to Khrushchev's speech. I think it was to the 20th Party Congress, 1956, when he essentially pulled the rug out ideologically from the standard Soviet view of communism. And at that point, you could feel among the intelligentsia of the world, I think particularly in universities, a shift away from old thinking toward one that was much more culturally focused. The idea had been, in hindsight, that the way that a political phenomenon would take place was, and it wouldn't have to be Marxist, but it was in tune with a Marxist view, and that is, you change the economic structure and the culture will then change. So economic structure change that, and then the culture will follow. And in these years, it turned itself on, or was turned on its head. And that, I think, comes out of Mao's Cultural Revolution, which I think Mao understood this, and in some ways, made it be known, turned Marxism on its head. That is, you change the culture first. The culture is the structure, and the economy is a superstructure. That is, unless you change the culture, you'll never get to imposing economic principles that we now claim to be the ones we hear the most about. So it's upside down. And from that point forward, you see more and more of culture as being the essence of it all when you are thinking about influencing world politics in general.
Thank you, Professor Hill.
Well, let me just, I guess, quickly throw in that I think that there was always, all through the Cold War, you can see a mix of ideological and non-ideological motivations. And the American government is never, and American society is never a single individual with a single purpose. So you look at George Kennan's memo, the long telegram, the X article, it's pretty realist. And it basically says, our problem with these people is not that they are communist, but that they are Russian. And he sort of builds a case on what you should do about that. By the way, it's sort of discouraging that at the end of the Cold War, he says, oh boy, that Kennan, he was such a genius. He saw it all coming 40 years ago. And now that the Russians aren't communists anymore, we can be friends. So, as somebody who writes essays, it's discouraging to see how even the most famous essay can be so totally misinterpreted. But in any case, a point is there had always been sort of disagreements in American politics about is the problem the communist philosophy or is it the power of the Soviet Union? And so you can see the shift moving. I would agree that Nixon and Kissinger had a pretty realist view of it, but we shouldn't forget that sort of the conservative Republicans rebel against this amoral Kissinger foreign policy. And then the liberal Democrats bring in Jimmy Carter, who also rebels against the amoral policy, and I'm putting this in quotes, and wants human rights to recenter it, then discovers that actually makes the relationship with the Soviet Union harder. But also the 1980s, I would actually call that a time of the re-ideologization of the Cold War, where Ronald Reagan, with talk of the evil empire and a sort of crusade against communism, mobilizes the US for that last time. So again, it seems to me that the Vietnam War is more of an incident, a serious one, but an incident rather than a major break point in the continuity of American post-World War II foreign policy.
Thank you, Professor. I want to ask a question that was submitted from a member of our audience. This question says, what are the limits of, and it's for all three of you, it says, what are the limits of realist foreign policy, and to what extent have the ends of US grand strategy since Vietnam followed some idea of realism?
I think the idea of realism, it's a word I think we would do well to get rid of it. We're not quite sure what it really means. And it's now ensconced in our international affairs teaching. So to me, it's better to talk around that to see what's really going on. And we're going to put labels on it. That is, look at what America has actually been doing. How would you assess the American way across administrations of either party? Is there a way to look at the Americans in the time period we're looking at, the 60s, and from that point to where we are today, and see if there's a certain coherence to it? And I think that there is. Can you put a label on this? I think it's, if you have to, it'd be Augustinian, in the sense of Augustine's City of God, with the idea that somewhere in there is a description of a philosophy of history. Take the religion out of it. That there is a way that you can track the course of history, becoming more this, less that, and it has a story to it. So when you begin to do that, I think that you can see, and I'm kind of putting this forward as a proposal, not a declaration, that the United States has been functioning as a keeper of world order. Nobody really voted for it. A lot of controversy over this party, this political figure or that one, putting words like realism on it or not, or neorealism and on. But what actually has been happening? And it seems to me that going back to the 1960s, and maybe before that, for 10 or more years, you see the US acting when some event threatens, from the point of view of Washington, the movement toward world order in a better sense. In other words, there's a kind of a test line that if it's below that line, you can leave it alone. You don't have to think about intervening or not. So if that's correct, then discussions about should the American view or policy be, and then you fill in the blank with a principle, that's a mistake, because it holds you to a principle that may not hold up. It's much more pragmatic than that. It's much more, as I feel, on a case-by-case basis. And the dividing line there is, will this particular matter really affect a world order? And I think in the case of Vietnam, the judgment was, yes, it will. In other words, if you look at it from the point of view of that time and how it was seen from Washington, what you saw then was divided nations. Germany was divided, China was divided, Korea was divided, and Vietnam was divided. And in the first three, the US got into it. So from that point of view, the US could not get into Vietnam. In other words, to go 1, 2, 3, and then drop out of sight when 4 happens. And especially when with a number 4, that's Vietnam, you can see the beginnings of a viable society. And put it in contrast with North Vietnam, you see a generally open, generally democratizing, if not democratic, South. And you see an autocratic moving toward dictatorial single-party state in the North. And put that in the larger regional or international category of world order, and you seem to have almost a necessity, automaticity for the US to get into that, which we then did. Now, how we did that and whether that worked is a separate question. But getting into it seems to me to be something that any administration, either party, would have done one way or another.
I disagree with Professor Hill. I mean, I disagree that I have to think that the term realism, the idea of realism, has value. We can have an extended discussion about what it should mean. But it seems to me that I think the question was asking to reflect on the sort of the period looking beyond Vietnam. Where we went wrong was when the Cold War ended. That's when we abandoned all realism. That's when we succumbed to fantasy. And the proof in part, I think, is the terminology that came to be in common use in discussing American statecraft. A unipolar moment. The United States as a sole superpower. The concept, I think, taken seriously in policy circles, that history had ended, that the United States was to function as history's indispensable nation, and that those claims, combined with the perception that the United States had mastered war, another idea that was kind of found favor after Operation Desert Storm, promoted reckless behavior, a total absence of realism. And it reaches its apotheosis in the wake of 9/11, when George Herbert Walker Bush, I think very accurately sort of reflecting at least one stream of the tradition of American statecraft, embarks upon a global war on terrorism pursuant to a freedom agenda, which has us ends up having us invading a country, Iraq, that had nothing to do with the 9/11 conspiracy, and plunged the United States into a war that cost us what, $6 trillion? We know the numbers: killed, wounded, people displaced. And in my judgment, basically threw away most of the benefits that we had in fact acquired as a consequence of the Cold War, during which period, even though we made a ton of mistakes like Vietnam, by and large, American policymakers had adhered to some version of realism. After 9/11, realism went away. And I think, and frankly, how did we get Donald Trump? Well, that's one answer to that question, is the recklessness and absence of realism that informed US policy after 9/11.
Well, I think, look, I would probably say that the term realism, has some use. It's, but like all political terms, what's a liberal? What's a conservative? The more important a political term is, the more everyone wants to define it in their own way, and the more difficult it is to have a conversation about them. But I think in terms of, can realism be an effective guide for foreign policy? In one sense, it's kind of axiomatic. Yes, well, you don't want an unrealistic foreign policy now, do you? So you got to have something there. But on the other hand, and by the way, realistic is the kind of policy I think would work. What's unrealistic is the kind you think would work, is often what that tends to boil down to operationally. But, in America, if you think about I would agree with Professor Bacovich that after 1990, American foreign policy went off the deep end in terms of it wasn't simply this idea that we could have a global transformation. It was also that we could do it on the cheap, that you could cut the defense budget, you could cut you could cut all of our budgets, you could require absolutely no sacrifice. But because history was on your side, the arc of history was moving in your direction, you could sort of coast home. And that, I think, was not realistic. It wasn't good liberal internationalism either. But in many ways, this, I think, reminds me of the 1920s American foreign policy consensus, which again simplified what it would take to get the kind of world Americans thought they wanted, and was kind of a way of avoiding hard questions about what kind of world do you want, how much are you willing to pay to get it. Once you know what the price is going to be, does that change what you think you would want? But if when I look at the Iraq War, it seems to me actually that there were several threads in the Bush administration pushing it, and one of them was realist. Dick Cheney did not have a freedom agenda. It was in his view, this was a necessary exercise of power to defend the homeland. And realists often make bad calculations of what the national interest really is. That's part of the problem, is that it's actually very, very hard in many cases to know what the wise course is. And so that the concept of realism in foreign policy isn't a rule that if you follow it gives you the right answer about what you should do. That's one of the problems with it. I think the other problem with it in the American context is just political. We can't do that very long as a people. The idea that America stands for something, that it has some sort of destiny in the world, that the American destiny is somehow connected with where the world is headed, is something that's actually sort of necessary to the internal coherence of the United States. And so a foreign policy which sort of openly flouts that ends up losing its political legitimacy pretty quickly, is again, I think part of what happened to Nixon and Kissinger. So realism won't tell you the right thing to do, and realism probably won't work for long in American politics. You can, I think, get to, the closest you can get to realism in American politics is probably to talk about, that America fulfills its global transformational role by setting a good example. That's as close as one can get, but it embodies this notion still of a transformational role for the United States in world politics. And then the moment will come when that's sort of activated. So maybe this is part of the tragedy of American foreign policy, is that while we might stay out of some troubles if we were more, quote, realist, we won't. We haven't, and we won't. And one has to me, part of being realistic, which is a little different, obviously, from being realist, is that you have to make policy for the country that you're in and not for the country that you wish you lived in. And my observations of American history and American society and culture tell me that this need for a mission is something that is just not going to go away in American political culture.
Thank you, Professor Mead. So I want to ask another question from our audience that's a little more contemporary. In fact, it relates to this past summer. It says, did the Department of Defense's forced uncomfortable role during the protests this past summer see a blow to civil-military relations as comparable to the height of the Vietnam War, or would such a viewpoint be exaggerated?
I'll jump on that and say completely exaggerated. For one thing, it's clear that the military really didn't like that. It's also clear that we now, just a few months later, have a president-elect who wants a traditional civil-military relationship and wouldn't think of behaving in that way. So I think it was an anomaly. I don't think it reflects any kind of deep crisis. And it's really quite interesting that, the military leadership has very, very consistently been signaling in every possible way that what it believes in is the Constitution and the civil order. So I think it's actually extraordinarily reassuring to know that the commitment of the American military to the American political, civil, constitutional order is undiminished. And I think I'm not alone in the civilian world for being very glad that that's the case.
I agree with that entirely. I think it was not necessary as carried out. It was the wrong message, the wrong symbol. And maybe the best part of it is I think that by doing it, we're not going to do it again. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think it has not convinced anybody that was the right thing to do, in my view.
Another question we had here that's also more contemporary, it says, what lessons will the Biden team learn from President Trump's failure to bring troops home? Will President Biden understand that the wars are deeply unpopular, or will he continue, as most expect, with the neoliberal tradition of waging war abroad in the name of democracy?
Well, let's wait and see who he appoints to the top positions. But all I know is what I read in the papers, and it appears that this is a president who is a centrist, who voted for the intervention in Iraq back in 2003. I don't know that he has apologized for that error of judgment. But we've got signals that he will keep some forces in Afghanistan. Now we got rumors right now that in the next 2 months, Trump intends to get everybody out of Afghanistan. That'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Biden has been very outspoken in promising to maintain the world's greatest military power. I don't foresee any substantial reduction in U.S. military spending. We have a lot of the rhetoric about environment, emphasis on environment, climate change, how that's going to get paid for, I don't know. One answer would be cut back on military spending, but it doesn't seem to me that that's in the cards. So it's going to be, to some degree, back to the pattern of behavior that prevailed in the post-Cold War period, that is to say, during the administrations of Clinton and Bush 43 and Obama, albeit probably Biden and his team will have come to recognize that invading countries, overthrowing governments with an expectation of putting in place a more desirable political order probably ain't a good idea, because we've tried it several times now without success.
I think our military leaders at present are making a lot of sense. I think they're good decision makers. I think in that sense, our military is in good hands. And I believe that what they're saying is commensurate with a moderate, restrained position. I don't see really with either political party's leaders any desire to break away from that. So I think it's a pretty solid and survivable way to approach things.
I think I would agree, by the way, that I think Trump would like to get all the troops out of Afghanistan and possibly also Syria before he leaves office. And that some of the sort of changes in personnel that we're seeing at the Pentagon are probably related to President Trump's desire to have somebody who will help him do that, as opposed to slow walking or whatever. My guess is that, I don't know about Syria quite as much, but if American troops are out of Afghanistan on Inauguration Day, if Trump actually manages to make that happen, I don't think that the new president is going to be rushing to get them back in. That it might be a sort of, he would accept it as a gift particularly if he could blame anything then that happens, and I think some bad things would happen, but blame them on Trump. Trump has broad shoulders for blame. I do think Biden will probably is more chastened. He's not looking, I think, for new countries to invade or new wars to start. But I actually think that, the American foreign policy is definitely shifting its focus from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. And it is astonishing to me to see from both very far left people on the Democratic Party and very far right people in the Republican Party, there is a kind of a confluence of interest and concern about China. And I think just as we saw the Obama administration make some, do the pivot to Asia, we saw the Trump administration take that farther. Other steps like the growing US relationship with India really go back to the Clinton administration. And every administration since then have been getting deeper, US-Japan ties. I think this is something that is pretty broadly grounded in the center and on the right and the left in American politics for now. And to the extent that China continues to behave in ways that many Americans see as threatening, then we're probably going to see an increase of American foreign policy activism, but focused to the Indo-Pacific much more than to the Middle East, barring unforeseen developments.
So another question we had submitted here, it says, it is often said that foreign policy has little to no impact on the way Americans vote in presidential elections. Do you think this claim can hold any water in light of Trump's victory on an anti-war and sort of neo-isolationist platform in 2016?
Look, I look at every election since the end of the Cold War, particularly where you had, think about 92, you had George H.W. Bush, the great foreign policy president, and then you had Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas, who said we needed to focus more on nation building at home. And so Clinton beats Bush. 2000, Al Gore, the great international statesman, with his great connections, and he's gung-ho about continuing the great legacy, the indispensable nation. George W. Bush, the governor from Texas, who thinks maybe we, need a humbler foreign policy, and we need to do nation building at home, and Bush wins. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, who is all over the place, she loses to Trump, who again is against this. So from 1992 to 2016, there's a fairly consistent message from the voters that they want less foreign policy and a less ambitious foreign policy. So actually what's interesting is that in 2020, Biden is the first successful candidate since the Cold War who seemed to be more in the mold of defending the conventional foreign policy. So that's actually quite unusual. And again, I think it's because to some degree, people's dislike of Trump and also maybe his foreign policy is just so noisy. They think a Biden policy would be quieter and less stressful, even if it was more activist in some ways. But this is a change. This is the first time since the Cold War that the activist in foreign policy has defeated a restrainer.
Yes, but wouldn't you say that as an issue, something that was talked about, foreign policy figured minimally in the run-up to the election? That's what it seems to me. And so then you say, well, why did Biden win? Why did Trump lose? Of course, we have to immediately remind ourselves that he got more than 70 million votes. But why did he lose? Well, because he's a jerk, because he's a liar, because he has failed to fulfill virtually all of his promises. He is a disagreeable human being. So what strikes me, I agree with your analysis. This is the first time we've got somebody who, there is a difference here. But the outcome of the election was not determined by Biden's stand on foreign policy.
Well, foreign policy, I think, is way down the list of issues that's going to make a change in the higher levels of our politics. I just think that the public isn't informed, doesn't care that much. And I think that even applies to matters like bring the troops home from wherever it may be. They'll ask you, where is that place? I think it's just a much depleted issue in general in our politics.
I don't think foreign policy played a much bigger role this time than in some of the other ones when the restrainer won. I think the most important comment maybe ever made about foreign policy by an American leader was Dean Acheson, who observed at one point that the average American has less than 10 minutes a week to devote to the study of foreign affairs. And that perhaps is as true today as it was in Dean Acheson's time. People have instincts and they have likes. They don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about how all of that fits into a coherent vision or strategy.
Would you say that about 2008? I mean, again, I would not want to argue that.
Well, I would say again,
let me make the case, if I may. 2008, we've got this young, charismatic senator from Illinois coming out of nowhere, who said, the Iraq War is a stupid war.
Yep.
Elect me and I'll get us out. Running against
and the Afghan war is a brilliant, necessary war that I know how to win.
Well, I was hoping you'd let me finish my sentence, so you go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I just wanted to throw that one in.
So I guess I wanted to ask a little bit, maybe push back a little bit. There have been some who have said that, especially you talk about the bipartisan agreement or the relative bipartisan agreement about the US needing to do something about the rise of China. And one idea that's frequently brought up is that the US needs to strengthen and maintain its relationships throughout the West, especially with our NATO allies. And President-elect Biden certainly mentioned many times that he sought to rebuild whatever system of international relationships and alliances that existed prior to the Trump presidency. And in many ways, President Trump did run on at least questioning or asking how fair are these relationships, how reciprocal are these relationships that we're in, especially with European nations. So I guess I wanted to ask a little bit, was there a role there in the 2020 election? I understand even if it wasn't the top of the list, do you think Americans were sending a message that they're not in favor of sort of the hardliner stances against NATO agreements, for example?
I don't see any message there. I don't think there's knowledge about it among the population, even the informed population. I don't think there's much of caring about it. As I mentioned, I think that a line for a politician of "I'll bring the troops home" means very, very little. I think in general, this is just far down the line in terms of something that the voting population is spending much thought on.
And I think it's always at the intersection of domestic and foreign policy that you get a lot more engagement one way or the other. So climate change was an important issue on both sides, I think, in 2020. And it clearly, should we join the Paris Accords or rejoin the Paris Accords? Should we be changing our energy policy at home and abroad and so on? A migration policy, is both foreign policy and domestic policy, refugee policy, all of these things. So, I think foreign policy is, enters into an election in all kinds of different ways. It's also a way that people signal. Israel policy, for example, is, is sort of a signal. Conservative Christians love Israel and want an uncritical support of Israel. So one of the things you sort of wave that flag, and a lot of people then assume that you mean a lot of other things. And in the same way, many liberal Jews are very, very worried about Netanyahu and worried about annexation and so on. And so you take a different stand and you send out a different set of dog whistles, not just where you stand on that issue, but on a whole lot of other issues. So I think politicians do communicate with different sections of the public by stands they take on foreign policy. But I don't know that there are that many single issue foreign policy voters out there. I think, for example, abortion on both sides has far more single issue voters than any foreign policy question.
Another question here, going back to the Vietnam topic a little bit. It says, maybe Vietnam did not change the US grand strategy as Professor Mead indicated, but didn't it change the intellectual trajectory of the country? Most of my Yale schoolmates moved substantially left based on their experience during the Vietnam years and have remained kind of antithetical to conservative thinking for over 50 years.
Well, to the degree that your Yale schoolmates represent the majority of the country, you're right, but I'm not sure that they do. It did definitely, the Vietnam War had a big impact on the thinking of a certain segment of the baby boom generation, one that reverberates in many lives to this day. But for many others, it rolled off more or less like water off a duck's back. But that's, I think, going to be true of any large public event. It affects a lot of people in a lot of different ways. Certainly, American politics as a whole was moving further to the left in the 60s. But with the end, in general, American politics has probably been more tracking farther to the right than most people in 1968 would have predicted that it would.
The questioner seems to imply that the Vietnam War was a conservative project. It wasn't. It was a liberal project. I mean, the presidents who, let us make sure that we don't discount the initial role of Harry Truman and then Dwight D. Eisenhower, but the presidents who played the key role in intervening in Vietnam were Kennedy and Johnson. Now, we can have an interesting argument about whether Kennedy was what kind of liberal he was, but he certainly was a Democrat. And Lyndon Johnson was the embodiment of post-World War II liberalism. So we need to be careful of the way we categorize things. The Republican Party then ends up being the Republican Party of Richard Nixon, who tries to get us out of the mess.
Professor Hill, you're muted. I think you need to hit a button and unmute. There should be a little photo of a microphone in the lower left of your screen. If you click that, it should unmute.
If you put the cursor on sort of at the bottom of your picture, along the edge of the bottom, the microphone thing should appear at the lower left. Hmm.
Well, I might ask Professor Bacovich a question that was submitted just for him, and hopefully we can get Professor Hill online. This question for Professor Bacovich, well, there were two, and I'll kind of combine them into one question. It says, first, could Professor Bacovich please finish his point about the 2008 election? And the second question says, what advice would Colonel Bacovich give to young military officers or potential officers who want to serve but dislike the wars?
Well, first, I'm not a colonel anymore. It's been a long time since I was. But the point I was trying to make with regard to the 2008 election is that I think that is a case when foreign policy played a large role, maybe not decisive. I mean, Barack Obama's attributes as a candidate were simply, stunning. His charisma, his ability to speak. He's a remarkable politician. But here we are. He was the guy who said, "I'm going to leave if you elect me," and Professor Mead is correct. He also said, "But if you elect me, I'll hang in there in Afghanistan." I happen to think that was basically political posturing to protect himself from being tagged as weak on national security. But he was running against a guy who was a great war hero, a significant figure on American politics, Senator McCain, who said, "Elect me and I'll see this thing through. We will prevail." And the American people said, "No, thanks." He was on his way. So advice to young soldiers, in particular young officers. I assume that if it's somebody at Yale, they're gonna get a commission at some point. I think the most important thing is to realize that when you take the oath as a lieutenant or an ensign, you become a servant of the state. Your job is to defend the Constitution. And that means you follow orders. You don't make policy. If you're given an illegal order, then you should disobey that order. But apart from that, you are an instrument of foreign policy. And if that becomes, too difficult, if you say, "I don't want to be used as an instrument," then probably being a soldier is the wrong calling. If you end up being a 3 or 4-star general or admiral, then you may, at that point, we're now 35 years after your commissioning date, you may at some point then be able to weigh in on matters of basic policy. But military service is not about making policy. It is about implementing policy. And I think one needs to go into it with the recognition of that fact.
Thank you. I wanted to give Professor Hill a chance to respond since he was muted. The question was about, I believe that was the question we were discussing about someone saying their experience at Yale and how they believed that the conflict in Vietnam moved most of their classmates quite leftward, and they continued to be inimical to conservative ideas.
Yeah, I was the time that you were referring to, the late 1960s, early 1970s. I was at Harvard, and I taught, was a fellow there. I watched the shift in American elite university culture. And in general, it seems to me that this comes back to the 1960s again and again. I think the case can be made in a way that American national character changed then. To me, somewhere between 1965, 1968, 69, 70, America became a bad country. That is and I have this from students at the 3 or 4 universities that I now have a pretty close connection with. They have this in their minds. They don't even think about it. They don't debate it. It just is kind of rooted in their mentality that America is a bad place, and that and Barack Obama said something like this when he began to run for office or the presidency at the very beginning, comes to the effect that wherever there's a problem in the world, it's probably the U.S. that's behind it. Somehow we did something wrong, or we didn't do something, but and this is something you occasionally get from students, a kind of a sigh, and but isn't it really all our fault? So that's fundamental. And somewhere in the 1960s, I do think national character changed, and that was a part of it. Certainly in terms of virtue, you could take a list of what was considered to be virtuous in 1960 or the unvirtuous, and by 1970 it was virtuous. A flip again and again and again. So this again comes down to culture, and it would be American culture in a larger, even global sense, that somewhere is, I think, traceable to the mid 1950s. I don't know exactly where, but somewhere in that decade, 55, 65 to 70, things really changed. And students today have a set of kind of automaticity of ideas that are given. They don't recognize that they are essentially givens for them, but they are. And the fundamental point is we're a bad country.
Thank you, Professor Hill. I wanted to, this perhaps will be our last question. We may have room for one more after it. But I wanted to get to the topic of China again, which has come up several times in today's event. So throughout the 1960s and during the height of the Cold War, American policymakers were able to manage a pretty tense and largely bipolar world order. So what lessons from the 60s and subsequent decades apply to the rise of China today and the potential emergence of another bipolar world order in the coming decades?
I think I question the premise. I find it unlikely that we're headed to a bipolar world order. I think it's much more likely that we're headed towards some kind of a multipolar order. The United States and China will probably be the two most important countries in that order, but there will be other entities that will have to be taken into account if we're going to have any kind of stability. Who? Well, yeah, Russia, the European Union, India, Japan, Turkey. It depends on how far you want to go down the pecking order, but the notion that it's going to be the return to some sort of version of the world in 1952, it seems to me is just not going to happen. But there are lessons to be learned, and I think one very important lesson is that even during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union found it possible to collaborate on matters of mutual interest. The most important of those was to find ways to curb the nuclear arms race that in my telling would begin as a consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, nukes are still a problem, and there may be a need for the United States and the PRC to collaborate there. But I think far more important, far more pressing, is going to be the issue of climate change, where we're a big polluter, they're a big polluter. If there's going to be any way to curb this threat to this common threat, we're going to have to find a way to cooperate with one another, even if in other realms the relationship may be one that is conflictive.
In the last 15 or 20 years, I think we have gone through peak China. In the early 2000s, Certainly in my circle of students and friends and colleagues, everything was China. On the rise to wealth and power, can't be stopped, inevitable. We hit a peak on that, and all due, I think, to the lack of success in a substantial way on many fronts in China by Beijing. So I think China is, in terms of how worried we have to be about it, and certainly in any bipolar sense, China is on a downward slope. So I think that we're past that period, maybe 5 or 7 years past it. What's just happened in Hong Kong, for example? If you check out what has been happening, Beijing has just lost Hong Kong. They tried, maybe they still will, but they'll have to invade something really flat out to turn this around. Hong Kong, leading city of the world, a leading world city, has decided they don't want to be part of this. And they're making their moves, even by boat people in a new way. So the China picture, as seen, I think, from Beijing, from the leaders there, is one that is keeping them awake at night.
Thank you, Professor Hill.
I think it's hard to, the thing about China is it's really hard to know what comes next, because it's a transformation on a scale the world has never seen before. They're sort of having an industrial revolution and an information revolution simultaneously in a country that has a greater population than the whole world did in the 19th century. I mean, it's the scale, the depth, the complexities are hard to measure. Any kind of comparison with the Cold War, you have to note that the Soviet Union really did not participate except in very limited ways economically, and that technologically it was sort of out of the running except in a sort of handful of usually militarily important things. And other than kind of ballet and chess, it wasn't a great cultural power. And when the kind of missionary zeal of communism began to decay, it lost its sort of, its strongest international network of supporters. China is a very different place, and our relationships with China are much more complicated. The world is more complicated. I think I would agree with Professor Bacovich that we need to, think hard about where we can and can't cooperate, and cooperate wherever we can. I would agree with Professor Hill that people often overestimate, China, trees do not grow to the sky, even in China. And that there are signs that the Chinese themselves are rather worried about their future. That can make them more dangerous, because a rising power can often say, okay, look, we have a problem here. Let's come back to it 10 years from now. We'll be in a better position to get what we want. It's Putin's awareness that Russia is a power whose future is bad makes Putin think, I got to go out there and get what I can get while I can. And it kind of puts him on a bit of a hair trigger. So a Chinese government that feels trapped or in a downhill slide may actually be it may be more difficult to manage our relationship with them. I would add just one thing about arms races. I think they're going to be much harder to control now. Nuclear, we never completely mastered dealing with nuclear weapons. The US and Soviet Union got some agreements, but the non-proliferation efforts, we slowed down the spread, but we never stopped it. And some people got nukes that we really wish didn't. But when you think about the emerging weapons, think of how COVID, the pandemic, has just the impact it's had. The lesson to a lot of people out there is that, whoa, what a fantastic potential there is for biological weapons. You think about what's going on in the cyber world. And it's a lot easier to track somebody's nuclear program than to track somebody's biology program or their cyber program. And furthermore, both in the case of cyber and bio, the technologies are pretty much all dual use. So that investing in building a huge, when North Korea builds a huge nuclear weapons program, it's not doing anything for civilian industry, or very, very little, relatively little. When you invest in cyber capability, you're actually developing something, or biological. You're doing something that actually is helping to keep your companies at the cutting edge of the world. So I think we're going to see that kind of research is going to be supported by a lot of different countries. The EU wants to get into it. Others are doing it. And it's going to be very, very hard to monitor. So I think the next generation, not just of China, but in a multipolar world, the next generation of arms control is going to be a lot more challenging.
Thank you, Professor Mead. As we only have 3 minutes left, I wanted to give each of you a chance to provide some brief closing statements, just kind of reflecting on our discussion today on this panel. Maybe a few thoughts that you'd like to leave our virtual audience with about this panel on the shadow of Vietnam and the legacy of foreign policy in the 60s. So we can go in the same order, starting with Professor Bacovich and then Professor Hill, and end with Professor Mead. Professor Bacovich, you are muted.
Not prepared to comment. I guess I would just say, as I'm a Vietnam guy, and I try to be conscious of the fact that of attributing more significance to that war than it may deserve. But it's kind of unavoidable because of my upbringing experience. I kind of think that the Iraq War is going to end up belonging in that same category of something that we will need to study carefully for some considerable period of time in order to identify sort of the innermost ambitions and deficiencies of U.S. policy. And I'll just stop there, and I'll say thanks very much for including me in this lively exchange. Appreciate it.
I think this shows the necessity, the imperative of really drilling down to see what is actually going on in a particular case. I think that we have done that today, reasonably so in a couple of cases, and that is to get away from the abstractions that are certainly in the university, in international affairs teaching. You put a label on something, becomes a principle of foreign policy, a principle of strategy, and then you try to adhere to it, to hold to it. Whereas that's not the way things really work. They really work by political leaders, democratically elected, if we're lucky, leaders who make choices about what to do and what not to do. A very practical, but it really requires pretty deep knowledge and close attention to what's really going on in the world in its most outstanding cases. So I think that that's the message I take away from this.
All right. Well, I guess I'd just like to close with a reminder. Maybe I know some of the people in our audience are students, and it's just worth remembering that the greatest consequence of any war is something that often escapes historians and political scientists, which is that the deaths and the injuries and the traumas of a war's victims, both civilian and military, and the consequences for their families and communities roll down the years. These change lives, change societies in ways that are hard, impossible to quantify. You can't track how future voting patterns necessarily change and these kinds of things. But war is something that engages the heart of a society for good and for ill in ways that we can't forget. And in that sense, the Vietnam War, where over 50,000 Americans died, many more injured, and of course, the Vietnamese casualties on both sides were much greater. That impact, I think, when the story of the human race is finally told, that impact will be greater than some of the political trends and voting trends that we've talked about today.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you, Professor Bacovich and Professor Hill and Professor Mead. This was a real privilege to hear from the three of you, especially hearing from the three of you in conversation and occasionally in debate with each other. So we really appreciate it, and we hope to have the three of you back to the Buckley program, hopefully some year in the future when we can do some sort of in-person programming. So thank you again to the three of you. I'm going to go ahead and end the call, and thank you to the audience who attended.
Thank you,
Thanks very
Kobe.
much.